5 reasons why you can't get enough traction for investors. In this video, I'm going to show you the reasons you are not getting the traction that you need to de-risk the investment so investors will come in and invest in your startup, especially at an early stage. In other words, this video is going to be focused on pre-seed and seed funding rounds. If you are trying to raise an A round, B round, you've got other issues that you want to be working on. If you're not getting the traction, those investors are going to be looking at your startup a little bit differently. Before we continue, I'm going to make sure that I qualify myself here and explain to you where I'm coming from. I have raised over 9 figures of funding for my startup and other people's startups, and I've learned a lot of lessons along the way. Also, I've worked with startups.com, the online accelerator, and there have been over 1,000 startups that have crossed my desk in the past couple of years. And I've seen startups raise money and then fail completely and get very frustrated. Startups.com has raised over $750 million for startups through Fundable. And we've learned some really great lessons along the way. And I'm going to break them down for you. Before we get into this, I am assuming that you have achieved 2 things. First is problem founder fit. What that means is you are the right founder to solve that problem. It's just not a problem that you care about and you know nothing about. You've got the domain expertise, you've got what it takes, and you know enough. You've embraced the problem enough where you are specifically the right founder for that problem. Second is that you've achieved problem solution fit. You've actually created something that people want to use, that makes sense, that people are using it. You're well on your way to getting people to love it so they begin telling other people and you start generating that almighty traction towards the elusive product market fit, which is what investors need to see in order for them to feel comfortable that you've de-risked the investment enough and they're willing to give you their hard-earned dollars and say, hey, I think that you're the founder that's beginning to figure this out. Remember, founder problem fit, and you're showing enough right now problem solution fit that I can give you this money and let's go to town, let's work together, see what happens. This is the technology innovation adoption cycle, and it's from The Diffusion of Innovations by Everett M. Rogers. I believe that Rogers wrote his book and came out in the 50s or the 60s, quite a while ago, and since then it's evolved. I want to point out something very clear to begin with. There is a chasm here. This is the chasm. This is the really difficult leap that every startup and founder needs to make, and it plays a major part into the reason you're not getting enough traction for your investors. Let's look at reason number 1, trying to reach the mainstream too early. What founders end up doing is they're focused on the mainstream market way too early. I understand how he can get there because you're trying to create a solution that solves a massive TAM, and that is the mainstream market. But the issue is how do you get to that mainstream market that represents your TAM, which is going to be worth billions of dollars because you're creating the next unicorn that's going to completely disrupt, start new categories, change behaviors, and be worth the hundreds of millions of dollars that you're going to be making, but the chasm stands in your way. So if you're trying to reach this whole section right here, right out of the gate, way too early, you are not going to get that early mainstream traction. Unless you've caught lightning in a bottle, there obviously are exceptions, but it rarely happens in that way. I would say I've never seen an instance where someone been able to go right to the mainstream market without a lot of hard work that goes behind the scenes into reaching the early market right here. These are the innovators and the early adopters. Sometimes it looks like it takes years and years and years to become an overnight success. Sometimes people have been toiling away at this early market right here, only to suddenly explode through the chasm and get to the mainstream market. If you're trying to reach the mainstream too early, you are going to create way too much friction and have a difficult time. How do you solve this problem? Focus on the innovators and the early adopters. Innovators and the early adopters, which are also known as tech enthusiasts and the visionaries. That's the first lesson I want you to do is start at the early market. Keep your focus there, create your ideal persona in that segment of this innovation adoption cycle, and you will start off on the right foot. Next reason, not innovative or clear enough for innovators. By this time, you said, all right, Ed, I've taken your lesson. I'm going to focus on the early market with the tech enthusiasts and the innovators. As the title implies, they're looking for something innovative. And if your solution does not satisfy that innovation they're looking for, well, it's not going to succeed, and you haven't achieved what I talked about right from the beginning, is getting founder problem fit or problem solution fit. Now, let's say you do have that. Well, then you're just not being clear enough. You're not explaining it to the tech enthusiasts who are most likely really smart and very enthusiastic. They're passionate and they will have a lot of empathy for what you're trying to do, but it's not clear enough. It's not clear in the way that it solves a problem for them, or it's not clear in the way that it solves a problem. Therefore, you have to be working on clarity. And sometimes that can be very difficult because founders tend to overcomplicate things. They start to say, oh, wow, but my solution does all this and it'll change the world and all these things. You have to understand tech enthusiasts know what you're trying to get at, and they're enthusiasts and innovators because they do want to change the world. But when I give a founder the gears and I really hone down and say, what is the one problem that you're trying to solve and how are you solving it? I'm trying to get to a place of clarity so it becomes easier for the tech enthusiasts, the innovators, to pick up. If you're not innovative enough, you're going to get that feedback. But then if you're not clear enough, it's just going to be so ambiguous, they're not going to know what to pick up on, and you're going to be lost right out of the gate. Reason number 2, not visionary enough for the early adopters. Here's the reality about startup founders. Most startup founders are already in this category. They are the innovators, the tech enthusiasts. What you want to do as you're in this category is first get validation from this group. You want to make sure that you are validated in your idea and you're communicating clearly enough that they understand your unique value proposition. But then as you sell to this next segment, the early adopters, you need to put a vision in front of them. Not necessarily the vision of changing the world, but a vision on how their lives can change, the benefits that they will begin to experience, and the benefits other people will experience as you begin to solve for the mainstream market's problems. Here, I'd like to take a moment and talk about the 3 types of startups that you could be making. And these 3 change the way that you go about get first traction, product market fit, and investors interested. The first type of startup is what's called an antibiotic startup. The antibiotic startup is something that people need or people are going to die. Therefore, the vision you have to paint to the visionary, the early adopter, is if you do not take this, you are going to die. Straightforward, simple as that. Or if people don't get the solution, everybody's going to die. Simple as that. That's an easy one, and investors are super motivated to invest in these types of startups. The next one is what's called a painkiller startup. This is like an aspirin. In this instance, the vision you're painting for the early adopter is imagine that pain that you have. Now imagine a world, your world without that pain, and I have the painkiller for you. Now imagine all the other people that have that pain. I can take that pain away and make it work for you. That's the vision that these early adopters want to hear. The last category is a vitamin startup. These startups, the vitamin startup, is very difficult. I'm just going to shoot straight with you. Very difficult to be competitive with and very difficult to raise money for. The reason being that people really don't need vitamins. Other people can create vitamins very easily, but they're not necessarily necessary like painkillers or antibiotics. People are motivated to go out and start using them. Vitamins are wonderful supplements to our daily lives, but to change behaviors, if you don't need them, that can be very difficult to convince someone to take your vitamins. I've got a load of vitamins here on my shelf just over there, and I don't take them every day. I have to have a reason. Typically, it's a pain that is causing me to take those vitamins. But if you do have a vitamin type startup, what you're looking for is a vision of how life gets better, becomes supercharged, how much healthier everybody is going to be, and you can start to paint that picture for these visionaries so they become early adopters and say, okay, I'm going to try that vitamin. Now that we've talked about the 3 types of startups, your focus is to make sure that the early adopters can clearly see they have a vision of why they should try your startup. Reason number 4, not adoptable enough for the visionaries. You've got early adopters, as the name implies, and you've got visionaries. You've got the vision down. They are saying, okay, I can see it. But then what ends up happening is they can't use it. It's not adoptable enough. Visionaries and early adopters will go through a certain amount of friction to get there. They will have a certain degree of leeway to give you, a certain amount of rope as far as bugs and different types of things that maybe create a little bit of friction, and they're more than happy to give you feedback because they know they're early adopters. If you're an early adopter of version 1 or a beta, you know it's going to be difficult. For example, I am not an early adopter of phones or technology, consumer-based technology. The reason I'm pretty conservative, I'm a late majority. I'm still on iPhone X. That's 4 generations or 5 generations back. I'll usually wait 3 generations. You know, the Oculus Rift or the Meta Quest, it's on version 3 right now. Since it's on version 3, I'm now potentially interested in looking at it. And that's only because all my friends started getting them and gave me really great reviews. I am a late majority. Maybe I'm an early majority. I'm verging on late majority on certain types of things. This is not me. But if you do not make something that I do want to be an early adopter of adoptable enough, in other words, the user experience has got way too much friction for me to actually begin to try it right out of the gate, well, then you're going to lose me. And this is where you're focusing on UX. Let me talk about something called an MVP for a moment. Minimum viable product. A lot of founders get minimum viable product confused with having a crappy user experience, or they think that a crappy user experience is okay in a minimum viable product. It's not. Especially today when MVPs are easier to launch and they come out with a little more sophistication and maturity, such as consumer-facing apps, a bad user experience is not going to cut it. In fact, the bar is going to be higher the more competition that you have and the more experience that your market has with these types of products. The bar is high, so your user experience has to be good. This is not to be confused with design, which is where I think some of the confusion happens. When we talk minimum viable product, I always ask founders, what is the minimum amount of work and resources that you can put in to quickly validate or invalidate your assumption? But if you can't even have the minimum user experience to get to the point where a user is going to validate or invalidate, then you're going to have issues. You can sacrifice some design. It doesn't have to have all the bells and whistles, all the branding colors, all the graphics, but it does have to be usable. If your MVP is not usable enough, the UX does not allow an early adopter with all the patience and leeway they're going to give you. If they can't early adopt it, then you're going to have issues. You are not going to take the next step and be able to cross that chasm because you need those early adopters to tell everybody else you need to use this and shoot you over that gap. The solution, therefore, is simple. Focus on user experience, test, get feedback, watch your early adopters use it and find out where those friction points are and fix it. Finally, we get to reason 5. Unwilling to do the things that don't scale. Let me explain this for a moment. Sometimes what happens is a founder is way too interested in technology and scale that they miss all the lessons that they could be learning by doing things that don't scale. Some examples of things that don't scale. In the past, when I built my first SaaS that was acquired, I did things manually. I went and I pretended that the software existed and I validated my market and I got a customer. Then I did everything manually. The startup was a B2B employee engagement software. And I said I have it and spat out all these reports and did these great predictive analytics. When I got the order, I went and did everything manually on my computer using Adobe Photoshop and Adobe Illustrator. And I sold it and I made money. That does not scale. There's no way that I could have taken another client at a time. I could only do one client at a time. But by doing the things that didn't scale, I ended up having the experience that I needed and learning what to build in the software a little later. Now let's go back. Even before I sold the product, I tested the product using spreadsheets. And let's go back even further. I tested the product using just a bunch of printouts and I had results from this assessment that I was trying to build. Even before the spreadsheet, I started with results. It was a paragraph on a piece of paper and I would slide it over someone. I'd say, read this, is this you? That does not scale whatsoever because not only am I doing things manually, I'm doing it one person at a time. When I'm trying to build a solution that takes care of companies and teams of 300, 3,000 at a time, it definitely does not scale. Other examples of things that don't scale are doing manual sales. Everybody tries to get tricky way too early sometimes when it comes to selling with automated customer acquisition and going out there and putting up funnels and landing pages and all those things. What about hardcore one-on-one sales where you can understand what the user is going through and go those lessons and get feedback on whether you're clear enough? That definitely does not scale because founder-driven sales are tough and you're trying to build your product, run your company at the same time, do market research, raise funding, and you're trying to do sales. That doesn't scale whatsoever. But if you're unwilling to do that, you're going to spend a lot of money and a lot of time trying to get traction. That's never going to happen because you're unwilling to do the things that don't scale. These are just examples from me. I know many founders that have raised millions of dollars by doing things manually first, selling manually, doing things that don't scale. And another benefit of that is your competition is going to look at you and say, they're not a threat. Not yet anyway, because there's no way that we're going to do that because we need to scale. Like when a startup reaches the stage where they're trying to seek business model fit, it's all about scale. And those startups ignore the little innovative skirmishes that occur manually that don't scale because it's just not going to fit their objectives. Their strategy requires blitz scaling. For example, this is something popularized by Reid Hoffman, where startups are scaling at all costs. Profitability goes out the door. We need to scale, 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 which is a very difficult place for a startup to be in. They will ignore the things that don't scale, such as these large incumbents. And that's where you can start to sneak in. Because if you're willing to learn the lessons that don't scale, guess what? You can start to scale very easily because you've been able to figure that out. I always tell founders, if you can learn to sell to one customer, make them super happy and love it, get $1 from them, and then get that person to tell one other user, you will know how to make 10 million customers happy, make $10 million, and go public and become a unicorn and all that stuff. It's very easy to do. But founders look at me and they say, what am I going to do with one customer and $1? It's metaphorical, but you get my point. They ignore the very things that require you to set the foundation so you can reach scale, do things that don't scale. The things that don't scale are different for every startup. So how do you figure out what it is that doesn't scale? Guess what? You have to ask. Ask the visionaries, ask the tech enthusiasts, and say, what do you need from me to try the solution? Or what do you need to experience to say, this makes sense for me to ask you, how much would you pay for it? Would you tell some other person? And if you have to do it manually, you're running around like a chicken with your head cut off behind the scenes, like I did, then go do it. But how you get there is you have to ask. You may have a bunch of assumptions on the things that don't scale, but until you go out and ask and then test and then finally learn from them, you are going to be stuck and you will not be able to cross this chasm here. There you have it. Those are the 5 reasons you're probably not getting traction. If you have some other thoughts and you're wondering, well, I've tried all these things, let me know. Your feedback is very valuable and always appreciated. And I want to learn as well on how I can help all you founders get that traction so you can raise your early stage funds a little easier. It's tough enough as it is. Let's work together to solve this problem and help us all get traction and raise funds together. Do the social media thing. If you found this valuable, like, comment, subscribe. And as always, if you're part of other communities with me, such as startups.com, Online Accelerator, I appreciate you all very much. We are recording this by the end of the year. It is currently December 19th. I just want to say thank you very much and hope you have an amazing holiday. I'll see you in 2024.